Welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and my guest today is Emily Schrader, social media guru. That's what I want to call her. She has her own consulting firm, digital marketing and branding expert, is on her website, and she's been around, for Welcome to EoZTV. I'm Elder of Zion, and my guest today is Emily Schrader. That should not have happened. Sorry. And she also is, has a history of what you like to go through. You've been doing social media for quite a while. So welcome, Emily.
Thanks so much for having me. I heard so good. I heard it twice already.
That's right. Usually I don't make that mistake. That's pretty unusual. Sorry about that. Anyway, these are the problems with live TV. But hey, this is part of the fun of it too.
It's authentic.
Yes, it is. I mean, you've been doing this stuff for a while already. I mean, I remember that when you used to work for Stand With Us. How did you get into this entire field of activism and social media stuff?
Wow, the whole field. Well, I guess I was always really involved politically, and so that was sort of where I was coming from when I started to get involved with the Israel stuff. And if you want to know the complete truth, the reason that I really started to get involved with Israel activism and activity was because of Apartheid Week. So I have SJP to thank for that. I was at USC, University of Southern California, where they just had a big problem this last week. Maybe we can talk about that later. And they had their apartheid wall with all of the anti-Israel stuff. And I remember that I mentioned to my friend, what is these people's problem? Why are they so obsessed with Israel? Do they not have anything else to do? And she was like, well, maybe you should join the Students for Israel or something. And I was like, I don't have time for that. I have too many other clubs. But then it kept happening and they kept having more anti-Israel activity. So finally I got mad enough that I joined the Students for Israel. And I was already pretty involved in Hillel and Kaban and doing stuff like that on campus. So it was kind of a natural transition for me. And then that's when I really started getting involved with multiple organizations, Camera, Stand With Us, others as well.
Which campus of USC were you on?
USC, there's only one campus in downtown LA, or almost downtown LA. Kind of a sketchy area, actually, but the campus is really nice.
Okay. I was getting mixed up, I think, with UCLA. Sorry.
Oh my gosh, they're our rival. How could you do that?
Sorry.
But yeah, there's a lot of problems across California campuses, and it's disappointing because in the entire time I've been involved in this field of Israel activism and pro-Israel activity, USC has actually been really good about pro-Israel stuff. When I was there, I think they actually suspended SJP for 2 years, the last 2 years of my university. And they were very, very strict about not allowing them to harass Jewish students, not allowing them to come to our events and to disrupt, which is a problem that we saw, of course, and have seen for many years across UCLA, UC Irvine, UC San Diego. So the UC system schools have a much bigger problem, I think. But just in recent weeks, even, we've seen a huge uptick in anti-Semitism under the guise of anti-Zionism on campus at USC also. So that's disappointing. But hopefully there's a alumna like me who will push back.
Yeah, and again, we'll talk about that later. Like you mentioned, that was a very interesting story this past week. But I do want to get into the social media stuff. I was fascinated that very recently you were invited to speak at the Knesset when they were quizzing various social media companies about their attitudes towards anti-Semitism. And I only saw the couple minutes that you put up on Twitter, but I'd like to go a little bit more into it because I'm sure you asked more questions and I'm sure they answered more. What exactly did you ask? I mean, I saw your question for Twitter, but can you just go over what you asked them and did they say anything that was useful?
In short, no. They didn't really answer my question. I did end up sending the Twitter representative the tweet I brought up before, but I want to go back actually because there were 2 Knesset committee meetings that I was in that both had representatives from the social media networks. This was part of the Aliyah committee, and I was invited by a member of Knesset, Michal Wunsch, who is actually the daughter of Erwin Kotler, who is obviously a very influential figure in the battle against anti-Semitism from Canada. And she asked me to come because I have a column in Jerusalem Post where I regularly write about like issues with anti-Semitism on social media. And I've been pushing for quite some time, along with other organizations like Honest Reporting and a few others, to have the social media networks adopt, at least in part, some part of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And that's something that Michal agrees with. So she asked that I will come as someone who has written extensively about this and like does research with the Tel Aviv Institute about this particular issue. In the first session, the representative from Twitter didn't have a very good day, I think. But first she was asked by me about their policy on Holocaust denial, which she basically, and I was shocked that this was her answer, but she said that they don't allow Holocaust denial unless, or only when it's targeted towards a specific, like, protected minority group. So I clarified with her in the meeting, you mean Holocaust denial is permitted if it's not targeted towards someone?
Right.
And she was like, yes, that would be correct.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if she truly didn't realize like how absurd that is. But most of us who were in the committee were just like, what?
Yeah.
And then Arsen Ostrovsky was sitting next to me in the committee, asked about the Ayatollah's tweets, which have repeatedly called for genocide against Israel and called for violence against the Jewish state. How come that's not against their terms, but they have no problem labeling President Trump's tweets about any number of things, mail-in ballots or speech referencing previous race riot, whatever. They've done multiple things now. And she basically just reaffirmed what he said and said something about how, like, well, we labeled Trump's tweets because we believe that it's in the public interest to not remove them. But the question wasn't about removing the speech. The question was about, like, why is it acceptable to label one of them, but not acceptable to label the other?
Sure.
When one of them is clearly much worse, much more violent. And not only that, but when it comes to Iran, like, it's backed up with action. How many terror groups are they sponsoring around even just this region? Sure.
Yeah, now that was a shocking answer that they said. What is I mean, again, in your experience or in what you've seen, how are the other social media companies dealing with this? What's Facebook do with Holocaust denial, or do they treat right-wing anti-Semitism differently than they treat anti-Semitism from Arabs or from Farrakhan type supporters or that sort of thing?
That was a lot of questions in one question.
Sorry.
So first I'll go through like where the different platforms are in their hate speech definitions. First of all of them ban calls to violence in any language. Now that is enforced better on some than others and enforced better in certain languages than others. In Arabic, it's really, really lacking across the board, but especially on Twitter and Facebook. YouTube, which is Google, is by far the best, by far, both with removing violence and with removing like anti-Semitic tropes, conspiracy theories, the use of like Zionism as a replacement word for Jews or Judaism. So Google is better. That doesn't mean they don't have a problem. There's still a lot of anti-Semitic content and calls to violence in Arabic. But compared to like how Facebook handles it or how Twitter handles it, it's a lot better. So when it comes to Holocaust denial, it's a bit more complicated because on YouTube, Holocaust denial is forbidden explicitly in their terms. And on Twitter, it's not forbidden. And they confirmed this in the Knesset committee. On TikTok, it's forbidden, but it's forbidden under these sort of like vague generalized terms in that you can't deny a specific historical violent event occurred to a specific group of protected people. It's like very convoluted. It would have been better off for them to just say, we don't accept Holocaust denial. But the thing with TikTok isn't that their terms are bad. or that they're not defining it properly. It's that TikTok leaves content up for so long, and they haven't, I don't know what's going on like internally, but they've, just a few weeks ago, there was an article about how like there was some video mocking like Holocaust survivors that had 6.5 million views before it was taken down. And like, I'm not a huge TikTok user, but even I reported it and it wasn't removed for quite some time. So this type of problem happens across the board, but even when they do define things as anti-Semitic in their hate speech terms, it's not always taken care of. Facebook is the really weird one when it comes to Holocaust denial. And I actually wanted to ask this in the Knesset committee and didn't get a chance to because we ran out of time. So Facebook, they have a similar clause in their hate speech terms saying that Holocaust denial in the same convoluted way that TikTok does is not permitted. However, Zuckerberg stated in 2018 to the international press that they would not necessarily remove Holocaust denial, even though he finds it offensive. So it's unclear if they would or they wouldn't, or they do or they don't, or it depends on what context, which I think is crazy, because in what context is Holocaust denial acceptable? That's the better question. So Facebook, we don't really have an answer. According to their terms, it could be interpreted as against their terms and it could not. It really depends. But all four of the major networks right now are lacking when it comes to modern anti-Semitism. And I say that I'm referring to using Zionism, using anti-Zionism as a way to be anti-Semitic today in a way that's socially acceptable. And I think that in order for these networks to really deal with anti-Semitism, which unfortunately we see rising on social media, they need to define it in a way that recognizes that. And that's why I've been pushing so hard for the recognition of IRA.
Sure. Have any of them acknowledged that? Have any of them officially said that they would consider IRA as an official definition?
So interestingly enough, the Twitter representative said that they are using IRA to help like train their internal content moderators. I know Michal asked in the committee meeting, like, well, can we see that anywhere? Do you have any kind of employee guidebook? Like, how do we know that's true? Because it's not anywhere on your terms. It's not anywhere on your website. It's not mentioned in your hate speech definitions. Like, there's no evidence of that. And she said, oh, well, maybe we can discuss being more transparent about like showing how we incorporate that. I know that that's what they said, but if that's what they said, then their enforcement of this issue is far, far worse than if they don't. That being said, I mean, the fact that they are aware of it and that they know that people, the Jewish community is pushing for it, it's a good sign. I just have very little faith given what's already happened with Twitter so far and their lack of responsibility and also transparency. I mean, the representative talked about how they have what they call, ironically, transparency reports. I've read them all, start to finish, and there's nothing very transparent about how much content they're taking down, how they define it. They have a generalized, in 2019, we received 56,000 reports of hate speech, and 20% of them we removed. Well, what does that mean? Like, hate speech against whom? Against which groups? In reference to which things? How are you defining it? Who is defining it with you? Are you working with the communities? Are you working with the LGBT community? Are you working with the Jewish community? Like, there's no actual accountability, and they don't release the data. And I actually did ask Twitter in the committee, I didn't post this video of it, but I did ask in the committee, like, do you have those reports? Do you have that data? And she said that they don't, which I think is crazy, because you have a network that's responsible for literally thousands, tens of thousands of pieces of anti-Semitic content that we know have led people to more extremism and even violent action against minority groups, but Jews, as we know. And like, you're not even tracking it. Like, it's just symbolic of how little they care about what's happening on their own platform. And I want to add one more thing about TikTok, that in the first committee meeting and the second committee meeting, both, TikTok was invited and they didn't show up. And for the second committee meeting, they actually confirmed that they would come and then canceled like late at night, the night before. And again, I think that for all their mistakes, I have to give Facebook and Twitter and Google credit for like at least showing up to have the discussion.
Yeah.
TikTok, like there's really no excuse for it, especially when like they're having so many problems with anti-Semitism on their platform. What's even more like shocking about it is that TikTok is like kids. Like these are like very young, impressionable people who are on this platform who are being exposed to this type of content, and they have a responsibility in a way that's slightly different than the other platforms to do something about it, and they're not.
Sure, absolutely. Were there any takeaways? I mean, did any of the big ones, Google, Facebook, Twitter, come back and say, we'll get back to you. We're gonna do something? Did they make any commitments whatsoever?
So Twitter did say that they would send over some of the data about what they were talking about and some of the evidence that like they're using IRA as the basis to train their staff. I don't know if that actually happened. I do know that in the second committee meeting, there was a different Twitter representative who came, and Twitter didn't say anything. They said that basically they were just there to listen, which is okay. Like at least they showed up, but at the same time, like you confirm that calling for genocide against Israel is not against your terms, and you confirm that Holocaust denial is acceptable in the last meeting, and you have nothing to say,
right, despite
an international press fiasco, despite the White House coming out against it. You have nothing to say.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
It is. Do you sense that when they do act, that they act against all forms of anti-Semitism, or do you sense that like right wing they're more likely to go after, but perhaps not left wing, or perhaps not anti-Semitism that comes from like a Farrakhan type perspective, or any things like that?
So I think there's a few phenomenon happening. I think that they are more likely to go after right-wing anti-Semitism, but I wouldn't say, and even though they have had issues of political bias, I'm not sure that it's because of political bias. I think that it's because they're lacking an accurate definition of anti-Semitism. And I'll explain, because on the left, we see, especially on the far left, we see a lot of like the anti-Zionism type content, like rhetoric. They won't say like we hate Jews like the far right and like neo-Nazis might say, but they'll say like we want Israel to be destroyed, or Zionism is a racist endeavor. Like these types of comments come from the left, and so it becomes, when it comes to enforcing like social media hate speech standards, it becomes a little bit more difficult, I think, for them to understand like the nuance when they haven't defined what the problem is. They haven't defined what anti-Semitism is. So I do think that they're lacking when it comes to enforcing, or even if it's like just labeling anti-Semitism on their platform on the left. That being said, they're not that great on the right either. On Twitter, there's a ton of neo-Nazis, a ton. And then I was just reading a report a few weeks ago from the Tech Transparency Project about some of the efforts that Facebook has implemented to shut down like white supremacist groups on their platform. And they have like a whole system that's supposed to redirect you to like a life after hate program when people search these like recognized white supremacist groups, like searching for them on their platform. Yeah. And in like 97, I think it was, % of the cases, like you would search like a neo-Nazi group or like a KKK faction, and it wouldn't redirect you, even though Facebook is claiming that they're taking all these steps to combat anti-Semitism and to fight back against white supremacy and racism. It's not actually happening in enforcement. And there's not a lot of accountability for that either. So, and in addition to that, another interesting thing in this report was that they had like, you know how you can add the place where you work on Facebook? Mm-hmm. So people kept being able to, like white supremacists kept being able to join groups and to find like white supremacist organizations by people listing that as their workplace. So then they started using that as a network to find other people. And this was happening for months and months and months, and Facebook didn't do anything. Even more than that, you know how Facebook will often like recommend pages similar to what you like? Sure. So when Facebook started seeing that like these people were white supremacists, then they would recommend other white supremacist pages for them to like. Yeah. So they're actually end up promoting white supremacy without, I guess, realizing it or doing anything about it.
Yeah, that's. Yeah, I remember when that was happening. That was like, is it still happening? I mean, I
Yeah.
remember we reported. It's still happening now. That's
Yeah.
truly
I
crazy.
think as of a month or so ago it was happening.
Oh wow.
Crazy.
Um, I mean, as you know, a couple of weeks ago there was, and it came out of England, the 48 Hours of Silence campaign in response to Wiley's anti-Semitism. Seemingly as a result of that, Wiley was kicked off of Twitter, as well as afterwards David Duke. Um, do you? I
It
mean,
only took them 11 years.
that's right. Yeah. What's your opinion? I mean, it sounds like a success. It sounds like it certainly got people's attention. It seems like it's a shame that it had to go that far. But what were your opinion of how do you think that worked?
I mean, I think that the whole 48-hour like Twitter walkout is fantastic. It got great press coverage. It's sad that it had to come to that point, and it's not just Wiley. It was like Deshaun Jackson and Wiley and like 3 or 4 other like international stars. I think quite a few athletes from the U.S. also. So it wasn't just Wiley that led up to it. It's that this is a pattern with Twitter. And I think it's really good that Twitter finally took action and that they banned Wiley and also that they banned David Duke after. But at the same time that they banned David Duke and they banned Wiley, they were in a Knesset committee meeting with me confirming that Holocaust denial is acceptable on their platform, and that the Ayatollah's tweets are okay. So it's like, yes, it's a step forward. It's a small step, but it's like so blatantly clear that they don't get it. Like they just don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
That this is an issue much larger than just like removing someone's account or even labeling someone's account. The problem is that they don't know how to define anti-Semitism. So it's going to keep happening again and again and again until they're able to approach it in a more proactive way.
And you're right. And clearly, a definition of anti-Semitism is what's necessary in order for them, to be a clear definition, which again, IRA is, and that would be, something you can point to, and the reluctance, and again, and the left wing, the left wing Jews, the anti-Zionist left wing Jews are so dead set against accepting that definition. What do you say when they say, well, some Jews are saying it's no good? So what do you say to that?
I think that the consensus Jewish community has already been pretty outspokenly in support of IRA. Not only that, 40 states have already signed on to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. So I wouldn't be too concerned about the people who are like saying that they don't agree with it, or the if not now or whoever. They're like the far fringe. But I do want to say that like one of the criticisms of IRA has been that it shuts down free speech or it censors free speech. And this is like absolutely not the case, because there's nothing in IRA that says you need to ban these forms of speech. It says that you need to recognize this as anti-Semitism. And I think this is actually something that a lot of other people in like the pro-Israel community might not agree with me on, but I am not so in favor of removing everything that's anti-Semitic. Obviously, I'm in favor of removing any kind of calls to violence against any group, but I think that it would be much more useful and powerful if Twitter and Facebook implemented some sort of policy where you had like people who were repeat offenders. Okay, maybe they get suspended or their account is removed or whatever. But when someone does something, when they say something that's anti-Semitic, talking about destroying the Jewish state or something that is like sort of on the edge that someone might actually say by accident. They might just be like pretty ignorant about it. It's much more beneficial for that user and also for the people seeing it to see that there's like a label on it that like, hey, this post by the general consensus Jewish community would be considered anti-Semitic and like deeply offensive to the Jewish community. Here's why. And then they can like read about it. And, if they can label Trump's tweets with fact checks, well, then they can label other things as well.
Sure.
And I don't see any reason why that isn't a better way to deal with it. I'm not in favor of censorship, even when it's gross, hateful speech. Only when it's calls to violence or when there's a clear cut path to violence, then I would be in favor of complete removal.
Yeah, and I generally agree with that. I try to be more on the side of free speech as much as possible, and I think that what you're suggesting is excellent. That they should be labeled and say, hey, for anybody who happens to be a bystander looking at this, here's why this is hate speech. But you know, I mean, just from my perspective, I want to be able to expose it too. And if it gets disappears, and I can't do that. It's much harder. You have to grab the screenshots and stuff, and you need to show to people, hey, here, this is what's happening today. So yeah, no, I agree with you.
Not only that, but when you remove people, they just go to other platforms.
Right.
So they'll just go to like Telegram or Gab or Parler or whatever these other platforms are that aren't censoring them. And then everyone will get mad that they aren't censoring hate speech. And then they'll censor hate speech and then they'll go to another platform. So it doesn't fix the problem. You're not actually educating anyone. You're not actually stopping anything. And you're not able to track it as well. Sure. I think it would be much better to try to educate people. I mean, imagine if like Ilhan Omar's tweet about all about the Benjamin's baby. Obviously, to me, as someone who works in this field, this is anti-Semitic. It's a clear anti-Semitic trope. But a lot of people don't see it. They don't know. They're not very educated in anti-Semitism and why that might be offensive and why it's so problematic. Maybe even herself. I don't believe that, but some people do. So imagine if like Twitter had just put something on that tweet saying like, hey, like you should know this is a little bit problematic. It would have been a very different story. And then we would have people, especially public figures, especially like celebrities and these star athletes we have making crazy ignorant comments. Maybe they would think twice before sharing content like that. Or if they did, then they would realize right away, oh, this is kind of problematic, and now I understand why.
Sure.
Rather than having it be a huge deal in the international press and a public shaming and a mess.
Sure. You follow the other sites, the like the 4chan, 8chan, Parler, Gab. Do you follow that stuff as well?
I've like checked out Parler a little bit, but I don't know. I wasn't really that impressed. And Telegram I'm on. Telegram is a little bit scary because it's much more secretive. It's not all as public. It's all like based on channels. And so you have to kind of know about the channels in order to be a part of them. And then also, of course, it's encrypted. So not everything is as public. So it becomes, Telegram is a bit more of a challenge to, I guess, police when it comes to hate speech. But I know that it's a huge problem on Telegram and that it's a growing problem on Telegram. I myself have been featured on several neo-Nazi lists. So I don't know what that actually means because I'm not in them. But I was warned that I'm on several. So I know that they're very active. On Telegram, but I'm not so involved in the other platforms on a day-to-day basis. I will say that I'm regularly on Reddit, and on Reddit there's a lot of anti-Semitic content, a lot. And Reddit has like a sort of, and it's a little bit like Wikipedia in the sense that it has like internal moderators of different threads. So there's varying levels of moderation. Right. And what content is and what's permitted and what's not. But there's definitely a community problem on Reddit with anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. That I think a lot of people aren't aware of because when you think of social media, it's not really a platform that comes to mind right away.
Yeah, but it's absolutely huge. It's a big deal. I mean, people are, again, they're the people that are watching now and then that will be watching it. What can we do? What's what do you suggest? When we see something, or if we want to get involved or that sort of thing, is it only reporting or is there something else that people can do?
I found as an individual, one of the things that's really effective is reporting, obviously, when you see anti-Semitic content. And then when it isn't removed, screenshotting it and posting it on another platform. I can't count how many times I've gotten content on Facebook removed because they didn't remove it. And then I tweeted about how they didn't remove it. And then like 2 hours later, it's gone. So that's one tactic that I don't know like how they're watching or how they see what's going on, but it's definitely worked for me before. and just exposure and continuing to talk about it, continuing to write about it on whatever platforms you're using, and to call out the networks when there is anti-Semitism and when there is bias. And also, obviously, as the pressure continues to grow, I know that there's a few organizations now who are working on pressure, and also members of Knesset who are working on pressuring these social media networks to be held accountable for the content that's on their platform, supporting that and sharing those articles and using the hashtags and engaging on social media. It's really, really important. And people think like, oh, well, what does it matter if I like post on Facebook or if I like this comment? But everything on social media is a numbers game, everything at the end of the day. And all of the networks operate the same in the sense that they're based on an algorithm. And the more interactions you have, also the more interactions in the shortest amount of time, the more powerful your voice is going to be, which is one of the reasons that it's hard for pro-Israel, and I say pro-Israel, but honestly, just like the truth about Israel, to come out on social media, because we're outnumbered. We're simply outnumbered at the end of the day. So the more times you like a comment that already has 20 likes on it, you know, a pro-Israel comment or a comment that's correcting misinformation, the more people are going to see it. So it's really important to engage and to engage as much as possible. Now, don't let it consume your life, because there are limits, but it's really important to engage as much as possible.
I love the idea of publicizing it on the other platforms, because that's essentially shaming them. You know, Twitter might think, oh, nobody really knows if it's over here, but then they see it on Facebook, or then all of a sudden, it's gotten out. And that's, you know, it's sort of like being in the media, but I'm like, that's a really brilliant idea. I love that. I'll definitely...
Shame.
No, that's really great. One of the people that's watching asked the question. It's a little bit specific, but maybe you have an answer. It said, what are good resources to show anti-Semitic Muslims that their comments are anti-Semitic?
In Arabic or in English?
Probably both.
In Arabic, I would assume that if the social media networks implemented what I think they should do, what I'm recommending with IRA, and not necessarily removing content, but adding like an educational aspect, and obviously that should also be across the board in different languages. And they would need to work with like Arabic speakers in order to ensure that like the way that these messages are communicated makes sense culturally, to educate the communities that they're operating in. Obviously, Arabic is a huge problem on social media, huge, when it comes to anti-Semitism. But I do think that it's an opportunity, like if they're labeling posts, it's an opportunity to educate an audience that wouldn't get that information otherwise. Mm-hmm. Because they're not going to get, like, where are you going to get information about the IRA definition of anti-Semitism in Arabic?
Sure.
It wouldn't exist otherwise. And that's one of the reasons that it's so important.
Absolutely. And I believe that only this past weekend, there was a commission, a British commission on Muslim anti-Semitism that's headed by a Muslim, that was describing not just social media. They were talking about, you know, how Muslims altogether in England are like twice as likely to be anti-Semitic than the regular general British population. And I don't know how much publicity that's getting, but it looked like that's something that could be leveraged at least.
I didn't actually see that, but that's fantastic. I mean, it's a great start to a big problem. It's not my community, so I don't know that I'm the best person to say like they should do this, and this. Yeah. But I do know that this, as someone who's an expert on social media and has seen for many years like what they're saying in Arabic on social media and how it's being framed, and also how the narrative about Israel is being framed, it's deeply anti-Semitic. It's much more anti-Semitic than what's coming from like criticism of Israel in the West. And I'm not sure that people realize that.
Sure.
Also have the problem with the social media networks with the content moderators, the people who actually end up deciding like, oh, is this anti-Semitic or is this not anti-Semitic? Well, it's going to be different people when you have people who are moderating Arabic content. And so I think that that's why it's even more critical that these networks have a uniform policy that's formed and modified and up to date with the consensus Jewish community about what anti-Semitism is, what it looks like, what examples are, how do we respond to it, how many times can someone say something before it's clear that this person is intentionally trying to promote anti-Semitic views. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. IRA's just the first step, but I think it's absolutely critical, especially for Arabic on social media.
Sure. And as I recall, you were also somewhat involved when when the Women's March was coming out with their anti-Zionist statements. What exactly happened there, and what did you do?
Yeah, so I was involved for a long time. I think like since almost the beginning of the Women's March, because obviously I have an issue with Linda Sarsour's blatantly anti-Semitic comments. I mean, this is someone who has been vocally exceptionally nasty to the Jewish community. And every time she calls out on it, she plays the victim and acts like her being attacked is somehow Islamophobia or whatever. But at the same time, she has no problem saying that Zionism is creepy and that oh, this was one of my favorites, that anti-Semitism isn't systemic like Islamophobia, which makes zero sense because hate crimes against Jews lead the field by double for the last the entire time I've been alive. Anti-Semitism has been leading the field, and that's in the United States. And the United States is less anti-Semitic than most of the world. So it's just ridiculous for her to make comments like this. And for that to be someone who is a leader of a movement that's supposed to be about promoting like equality, it's supposed to be about promoting equal rights for women. And like, I am a feminist. I consider myself a feminist and I am an activist in this field. And it's appalling to me that they would have someone like that, like be speaking for me. And then in addition to that, her comments saying that, that you can't actually be feminist unless you're a Zionist. It's just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And what ended up happening was that due to her comments and also Tamika Mallory, another person with ties to Louis Farrakhan, a Nation of Islam, who has made multiple anti-Semitic comments herself, eventually got forced out because of public pushback from the Jewish community and other people as well, calling them out for the comments that they made. And then they replaced Linda Sarsour with Zahra Bilou, I think her name was. And I don't remember, she was on like the board of CARE, I want to say. I don't remember exactly which organization she was affiliated with. But then, I mean, within days, then it came out that she had comments that were even worse than Linda Sarsour's on her Twitter. Yeah. I don't know why it's so hard to find someone who isn't anti-Semitic to be a feminist leader, but apparently that was quite difficult for them. And then I think eventually either she was forced out or she stepped down, and now I don't really know. Now it sort of broke up because they had a lot of other controversies, like with financial transparency. So thankfully, they don't have as much of a stronghold on the Women's March. I think that, at least for me, feminism is far too important of a cause for people like that to be leading the charge. And I also disagree with this like litmus test that, you know, well, you can't be a feminist unless you agree with me on every single other issue. Well, no, obviously that's not the case. Right. There are people who are Zionists who don't necessarily agree with everything that I think about feminism. And there are people who are feminists that maybe don't agree with me about what I think about other groups, immigration. I mean, who knows? Right. There's this whole idea of like ideological purity. It's just a way to silence dissent and to silence voices that you don't agree with. And I reject this completely.
No, and absolutely, and it's also, I mean, yeah, I don't like to overuse the term anti-Semitic, but when black people and other people of color and and Arabs or whatever can all part of intersectionality, but Jews somehow aren't considered one of those groups, a victimhood group, and everybody else is. It's like, there's something going on over here. There's it is, if there's a fundamental anti-Semitism there. They're saying, well, Jews are that we're white, yeah, we're all white. That's an insult. But that's not. But calling Jews white or calling Jews white supremacists or something like that is not considered anti-Semitic. It's just there's some craziness going on over there, which is
yeah. I think that whole mindset is part of it's like an effort to rewrite history. It's part of like a narrative where you are cutting off the indigenous roots of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And it's something that people like Sarsour do very effectively and very intentionally, because that is the narrative that they want to promote. The problem with it, of course, is that Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel. Jews are not white. Even if they're Ashkenazi, Jews are not white. And that doesn't really jive with the narrative that they want to push. And I think that that's something that we need to push back against strongly. Now, that doesn't mean, and maybe, I don't know if you agree with me, I don't think that that means that like everything about intersectionality you need to reject. I think that there is something to be said for like groups who face different forms of discrimination, identifying with each other, and understanding that there are connections between different forms of discrimination against groups, and that we are more effective and stronger when we work together. But when it comes from a place where you're trying to erase the indigenous roots of an entire group of people to fit your political agenda, which is what people like Sarsour have,
Sure.
That is unacceptable.
Yeah, and I absolutely do agree with that. Obviously, there are people that are, you know, that racism exists and discrimination exists, and people that have, women that are people of color, do face multiple levels of discrimination that go way beyond what any of them individually do. There's something to intersectionality. I'm not saying anything against that, but when it's being, oversimplified into you're either a victim or you're an oppressor, that's where it turns into its own type of hate speech.
Yep, I agree completely. The irony, of course, is that that's even something that Sarsour, I remember she said something about how like, well, you're either on the side of the victims or you're on the side of the oppressors. And her implication in this, of course, is that Israel is the oppressor. But that makes no sense, because it's the Jews. It's the Jews who have been more historically oppressed than any other group. Like, what are you talking about? The Arabs colonized this area. They colonized and ethnically cleansed minorities throughout this entire region.
Right.
So it makes no sense.
Yeah. The Berbers and the Copts might disagree a little bit with that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And yeah.
Anyway, this was really great. Thank you very much for joining me, Emily. Again, let me just point to your own website over here. You have your own consulting firm. It looks like you can just go over what you do about that.
We do digital marketing.
Cool. So people can go to just emilyschrader.net if they need any help on that. But in the meanwhile, I am Elder of Zion, and going to say goodbye, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks a lot, Emily.
Thanks.